morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Marcia Eli. I am the Vice President of Programs and External Affairs here at the Brooklyn Historical Society. I think that the number of people in this room is a real indication of how pressing this particular program is that we have tonight for you. I always like to find out how many people are here for the first time. A number of you are here. So excited to welcome you. I'd love to hear how you heard about this program, and I hope that you come back to the Brooklyn Historical Society. We do many, many programs. In fact, sometimes 3 a week. And if you'll indulge me, I would love to tell you a little bit about some of the things that are coming up that I think might be of particular interest to you because you're here tonight, before we talk about why we're here tonight. Down the road, actually, in January 28th, we have another discussion about our criminal justice system. This one is in partnership with our very good friends at the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. I know some people are here from the Bail Fund and would like to welcome them. Yes. We've done annual programs with the Bail Fund, and they are wonderful partners, and it's incredibly important. So along with Peter Goldberg, the head of that organization, that night in January, we will welcome author Alexandra Natapoff, whose new book really says it all about the program. It's titled, Punishment Without Crime: How Our Mass Misdemeanor System Traps the Innocent and Makes America More Unequal. So that's off in the future. Coming up in a more timely way, not next Monday, the week after next Monday on the 5th, it's the night before the midterm elections. And we will be hosting a program called Elections in the Age of Trump. Claire Malone, who many of you may read from 538, and John Sides, who today actually had a book come out called Identity Crisis, the 2016 Presidential Campaign and the Battle for the Meaning of America, will be here together to share their insights about our election process, what has happened in these last few years since 2016 and where we're going. And then finally, there's a program that I thought might be of interest to you in December. It's called Performance as a Tool for Social Justice. And in that program, 2 esteemed members of the performance world who have worked with the incarcerated and whose work discusses criminal justice will be here. Brian Dories is one. He is the director of Theater of War, whose work Prometheus Bound describes challenges faced by people who have been incarcerated or are on probation or on parole. And he'll be here with Sean Leonardo, who created the series I Can't Breathe, another performance work, as a response to Eric Garner's killing. And they will talk about the power of their work and actually demonstrate for us that night in performance the power of their work. So those are just 3 programs that we have coming up. Grab one of these on your way out to see the other things that we have, and sign up for our email and please come back. I want to welcome somebody else who's special in our audience tonight as you came in, and who's very pertinent to the topic that we're discussing. You may have seen this book. This is an award-winning book called Lockdown on Rikers in our shop, and its author, Mary Buser, is here in the audience. Mary, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your work on this book. So tonight, we're talking about the path to a post-Rikers New York City. It's been 1.5 years since the Lippman Commission released its report, and that report was designed to help New York City move towards closing Rikers, improve the overall functioning of our criminal justice system, reduce the unnecessary incarceration, and encourage the development of state-of-the-art borough-based jail facilities. There are many fundamental questions that must and will be resolved to make this vision a reality. And tonight we have an extraordinary, really an extraordinary group of criminal justice experts whose views and insights will, if not provide answers, they'll certainly shine a light on the complexities. And I want to sort of personally say thank you to all of them for being here. Thank you all for being here tonight. They're hiding. But you'll see them soon enough. Just a word about how the evening will go. I, in a moment, will introduce our moderator, who will in turn introduce our panelists. After this discussion, we will be handing out index cards to anybody that has a question. There will be an audience Q&A. We will collect those cards and bring them up so that your questions can be part of the evening. So now I have the privilege, really, of introducing someone who I have been reading in the New York Times. I feel like it's daily. There's something that she has written. And she is the moderator for this evening. Ashley Southall. Ashley Southall is a criminal justice reporter who covers crime and policing at the New York Times. A graduate of Howard University, she was part of a team at the Times that examined the driving forces behind murders in the 40th Precinct in the South Bronx. She previously covered breaking news events like the fatal police shooting of Michael Brown and the Charleston Church Massacre, and she worked as a news assistant contributing to coverage of Washington under President Barack Obama. Her current interests include domestic violence, policing, the effort to replace the Rikers Island jail complex in a decade, and of course, the lottery jackpot. Please help me welcome Ashley Southall.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad that you all came. I am very excited for this opportunity and so excited that you all showed up. It's a lot of you, and I'm very nervous. I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists. The first person that I'm going to introduce, can you all hear me? You can hear me? Okay. The first panelist that I'm going to introduce is Akeem Browder. He is a social justice advocate and agent of change, a native of the Bronx. He works to honor the legacy of his brother, Kalief Browder, whose story you may have heard of, and his mother, Vanita Brown, by working with elected officials, lawyers, doctors, college students, and community-based organizations to change the laws, policies, and regulations that devastate poor communities and families that have been impacted by mass incarceration and solitary confinement in state prisons. He works in jails too. Akeem is the founder of the Kalief Browder Foundation and shut down Rikers, and he's a civil engineer by trade. And he's currently traveling the country and promoting a 6-part Spike TV docuseries called Time, the Kalief Browder Story. The next person is Professor Michael P. Jacobsen. He is the executive director of CUNY's Institute for State and Local Governance. Before joining CUNY in May 2013, he helped to create the Institute for State and Local Governance and was president of the Vera Institute of Justice, where he served from 2005 to 2013. He's the author of Downsizing Prisons, How to Reduce Crime and End Mass Incarceration. And he holds a PhD in sociology and has had an ongoing academic career with more than 20 years of government service. From 1998 to 2005, he was a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center at CUNY. And he was corrections commissioner from 95 to 98. And if you have been in New York a while, I'm not a native New Yorker, but the 90s were a pretty bad period for crime, and one of those decades where our prison population increased dramatically. As he was New York Probation Commissioner from 92 to 96, and then he worked in the New York City Office of Management and Budget from 1984 to 1992, where he was a deputy budget director. He was in charge of money. From 2010 to 2012, he served as the chair of ALTUS, a global alliance working across continents and from a multicultural perspective to improve public safety. That's Professor Michael Jacobson. The next voice who will take the stage is Dana Kaplan. She's the Deputy Director of the Closed Rikers and Justice Initiatives in the Mayor's Office for Criminal Justice. Previously, she was the Executive Director of the Juvenile Justice Project in Louisiana, and that is a New Orleans-based nonprofit and legal advocacy organization. She's also been a Soros Justice Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and was a statewide organizer for the New York Campaign for Telephone Justice. She also worked for University of California, Berkeley, and she also worked for the Moratorium Project based in Brooklyn, and she has her bachelor's from University of California, Berkeley. She has a fancy education, and a master's from CUNY in American Studies. The next voice is someone I call about once a month. Her name is Insha Rahman, and she is the project director at the Vera Institute of Justice, where she leads their work on bail reform and decarceration, which is the theme of the night, right? And she has published research on bail and jail trends across New York State, and presents to advocates, judges, defense attorneys, and prosecutors on bail reform, pretrial justice, and reducing jail incarceration. From 2016 until last year, she was a staff member on the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform. That is the blue ribbon panel that came up with the idea and the plan to close Rikers Island. And she's been quoted as an expert on bail reform in a number of publications, including the New York Times. She is a board member at the New York Civil Liberties Union, the New York State's first department's Indigent Defense Organization Oversight Committee, and the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. Before joining Vera, she was a public defender at the Bronx Defenders for 5 years, and she also worked at the Center for Alternative Sentencing and Employment Services, a spinoff of Vera that provides alternatives to incarceration for youth and people with mental illness. Prior to law school, she worked at Vera's Center on Immigration and Justice. She has a JD from CUNY School of Law and a BA in Africana Studies from Vassar. Thank you. So, how do you work this? So, these four will not be the only ones answering questions. I will be asking questions of you. And so I hope that you have done a little bit of studying and are ready for what's up. The first thing I want to talk about is the systems that are involved in sending people to jails. Part of people's first interaction with the criminal justice system is the police. And it starts with encounters in the street, in transit, in their homes, cars. And recently, we've seen the police and the district attorneys back away from some forms of aggressive enforcement and prosecution tactics. We've seen that with fare evasion being reduced to a violation, and we've seen that with some DAs backing off of prosecuting people for having marijuana and smoking it in some places. My first question is for Michael is, are we seeing the end of this style of policing that has helped to fill our jails?
Well, I don't know if you're seeing the end of it, but it's certainly been going in that direction. So to give you a little sort of historical context of how we got to where we are, over the last 20 years, the whole system, and certainly the size of Rikers, looks very different today than it did 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, there were probably 375,000 arrests in New York City, probably around 125,000 admissions to Rikers Island, and the average daily population back then was sort of approaching 20,000. Fast forward today, the number of admissions is closer to 50,000. The average daily population is under 9,000. Arrests are easily 100,000 less than they used to be for some of the reasons you've talked about. So it's a much smaller footprint, and in fact, the reduction in the size of the city jail system it actually peaked at about 22,000 to under 9 is probably the largest example of local decarceration in the United States, maybe except for New Orleans, which is a different story. So the system has sort of been moving slowly in that direction. We didn't mention stop and frisk, but that was a sort of central part of kind of quality of life, broken windows policing. That peaked, as far as we know, at about 700,000 stops about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's now 10,000. So the numbers have generally been going down, arrests, admissions, and the size of the system. So does it signal the end? You can sort of debate that, but it certainly signals an overall shift away from sort of high volume arrests, admissions that we saw in the last couple of decades.
And so what does that smaller footprint mean in a system where, for jails, particularly when we're trying to create a smaller system that has a less harmful impact on communities?
Right, well, the goal, especially in a jail system, there's always going to be a small amount of people who are sentenced to misdemeanors. There's a relatively small number of people there for city sentences. But for the most part, 75 to 80% of folks are pretrial, right? They're pretrial detainees. They're there awaiting the pendency of the case. Most of them are there, not all of them, but most of them, because they can't afford bail that's been set. But the only reason to deprive someone of their liberty and hold someone pretrial, there's only two reasons. One is if there's some reason to believe you're a high likelihood of flight and you won't come to court for your appearance, or two, there's a reason to believe you're a high risk to public safety. Absent those two things, no one should be in jail pre-trial. Whether you're incredibly poor, whether you're a billionaire, it shouldn't matter. Those are the only things that matter. And I think certainly there's a consensus that even though the system has gone down from 22,000 to, again, less than 9 now, it can go down further. People, I'm sure here, will debate what that number is. On the commission and the mayor, we think we can get it down to 5,000. Other people can have a different number. But the goal is to have the smallest system possible. That's one part of the system, but then you want a dignified, sort of humane system that is run essentially on the principles of human dignity and respect, and that's not exactly what we have now. So the goal is to both shrink the size of the system, hold people who are in the system closer to their families, and run it in a very different way than it's been run in the last several years.
And in New York, the bail law is interesting because it's, at the same time that it's really progressive, it also doesn't allow judges to take public safety into consideration. And what we saw a few months ago was there was a guy who the judge in Nassau County had released, and then the police now believe that he is responsible for a murder here and possibly a rape in Los Angeles. And but the consideration for public safety can be tricky, and it's one that is fraught with many that leaves room for stereotypes about race to filter in. And I'm just wondering if you, Insha, if you want to chime in, if there's room in New York to kind of reconsider whether or not to allow judges to consider public safety.
Want me to take it? So The question about public safety and really sort of like who is potentially dangerous or not is one that's incredibly fraught, because the media and our country, from our history of and our legacy of slavery onwards, like we have a criminal justice system where it is primarily black and brown people who are getting arrested, black and brown people who are being prosecuted, black and brown people who end up at Rikers Island, and those statistics are stark. And so when we talk about a valid purpose of detaining somebody, of taking away their liberty, and we say, well, one of the only reasons we should be able to do that is if they pose some risk, we need to really think carefully about what risky or danger looks like, especially when we know that the average person in front of a judge who is making the decision about bail is usually a young black or brown man, and from literally just a handful of neighborhoods across New York City. So it's deeply, deeply fraught with questions about race and equity and fairness. That said, I think there's a real sort of opportunity to reconsider why we actually put people in jail and deprive them of their liberty pre-trial. Historically, in New York and actually around the country for centuries, the only purpose of detaining somebody pre-trial and the reason to even have a money bail system was the idea of, if you have skin in the game, if you have some amount of money that you don't want to lose, you'll come back to court. And so that's the historical origins of a money bail system. What we've seen now and what data shows us is that actually people who are just released on their own recognizance, or people who are released and make their bail, they come back to court. The numbers in New York City are that 88% of people come to their court date on their given court date. And if you allow for people to be human, which is they miss their court date because of illness, because they can't get childcare, they can't pay $2.75 to get to court, they will lose their job if they don't show up that day and instead choose to go to court. If you allow for people to come back voluntarily and show up for, a week or 2 weeks later, that number of people who show up in court is actually 93%. So we don't have a problem with flight or failure to appear. In fact, we know that we can get people back to court. And so that causes us to really sort of question, why are we using money bail? And what we know is money isn't really what gets people back to court. What I think gets people back to court is if I'm accused of something and I'm charged with something, I take that process seriously. And as a public defender in the Bronx, which is where I practice, I would see this time and time again. Even clients that I represented who are homeless or who have really tough lives would show up to court, would be waiting there for me at 9:30 because this is a criminal process. This is a process that people want to make sure doesn't sort of ensnare them in the system further. And so when we're at this moment where we know risk of flight is not really a valid reason to keep somebody in jail, we're confronted with the problem about risk to public safety. And it's a question that our legislature asked itself back in 1970, which is when we developed the current sort of framework of our bail statute. And the legislature decided back then, no, it's too fraught with concerns about race and bias to actually allow for public safety. And interestingly enough, almost 50 years later, we're having the exact same conversation. It's a conversation we need to think about very, very carefully.
I'm glad that you brought that up because I want to talk about that. I want to see how much the audience knows about New York's bail law. A quick question, how many people know how many forms of bail there are in New York? All right, you can put your hands down, so it's just a few of you. Okay, New York's bail law gives judges 9 different options for assigning, for how the conditions of a defendant's either release or staying at Rikers. And but you go into court on any given day and you'll see the defendants come in handcuffs from a room off the side. And in this process that takes about 5 minutes, you'll see the judges do 2 things. They will either decide whether to let someone go right there so that they can either dismiss the case or so they can fight their cases from the outside, or they'll decide, I need a little assurance from you in the form of bail that you're gonna come back and see this case through. And they'll either assign cash bail or a bail bond. But they have other options that are less onerous. Bail bondsmen are private agents, and the standards for them have gotten stricter, but they're not that strict. Families get taken for a walk, and whether or not a case results in their favor, they're on the hook for thousands of dollars in many instances. So imagine being an innocent person and going through a trial and then being not guilty and still having to pay $10,000 for someone who kept you out of jail while you were fighting your case. And that is a reality for many New Yorkers who don't even have $500 in the bank on any given day. So what I wanted to ask is, what did I want to ask? In this conversation about bail, we know that the severity of the charges weigh very heavily on judges' decisions, and we also know that the DA's request for bail, when you're arrested and you go before a judge, the judge is going to hear the charges, and the DA can say, yeah, judge, we want to have him held on $5,000. And it's always these random $250, $500, $1,000 increments. How can we get inside of judges' heads and get them to think about assigning bail that is not only affordable, but also releasing people? And Insha, you might want to take this question, but I'd also like to hear from you, Professor.
Sure. Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I mean, two things before we even get to how people can modulate money bail. I think, as Insha said, there's really, certainly for me and a lot of people, that the introduction of money into these systems is just an unmitigated bad. That's true throughout the system. That's why private prisons are bad, because when you introduce private capital into these systems that control people's lives, in corrections case that has the power to kill people in those systems, nothing good can happen. And the problem with bail, as Insha said, is it's been proven over and over again that the theory of having skin in the game, that if you just put in your own money, it'll increase your likelihood to come back, we know is not true. Right? And so if that's not true, why do you do it? And there's a whole host of mostly political reasons why you do it. And, there's a sort of cover your ass piece of this for judges who do it. And so, in some ways, ideally, you'd like to go right to before you spend a lot of time on modulating how judges think about bail and trying to get them to, marginally reduce the amount of bail. You'd like to just get rid of cash bail. It's a complicated thing because you have to substitute something else. There has to be some other way to sort of sort through then who, if anyone, goes in pretrial or not. But judges have a pretty good sense, really, informally, about who can make what amount of bail. So, a judge will frequently set a low bail that seems relatively low, but that judge knows this person is not going to make the bail. I don't have to set it at $50,000. It can be $500 because I know, the person's not going to make it. But what happens, just to give you a sense of how the system works, for people who get low bail, what happens is for those 50,000, let's call it, admissions to Rikers Island, over half of them stay less than 72 hours. Right, there's just an incredible churn, right? From a policy point of view, it makes no sense. From a moral point of view, it makes no sense. From public safety, it makes no sense. It's a horrible process. And the reason that happens is because once you're there for 3 days and you make 25 phone calls and you can possibly put together the $250 for your bail, you get out, right? And so it raises the question, well, why would you have bail in the first? Why? What's the point of that? And there is no point of it, but it's very difficult to get judges who, are sort of masters of their kingdoms and operate with a lot of different incentives to change that. People have tried over the years, which is, for me, the solution ultimately is less, let's try to get all these hundreds of judges to think differently about bail than just to get rid of bail.
I think all of us Well, I don't actually mean to speak for the whole panel, but I think all of us agree money bail needs to go. But in the system that we have, because that requires a legislative fix up in Albany, and as we know, things in Albany are fraught, perhaps maybe less fraught after November 6th, we'll see. But so we've actually been running, and we, the Vera Institute, we've been running an interesting pilot project up in 2 courthouses here in New York City to actually test that theory of what does it take to get judges to think about somebody's financial circumstances and their ability to pay bail, and how to actually set bail that is skin in the game, if that's the game we're going to play, but doesn't hold people in jail simply because they don't have that money to afford it. And so, you know, Ashley mentioned there are 9 forms of bail available under New York law, and judges can set all 9 forms of them. They actually routinely only set 2. One is cash bail, which is the full amount of the bail, so $10,000 cash bail. You have to put up $10,000 with the court. And at the end of the case, so long as the person makes all of their court appearances, that money comes back to whoever put it up. But that person needs to have a good amount of capital to put up in the first place in order to free their loved one. The other option that judges set routinely is insurance company bail bonds. That's going to a bail bond company. You can see a couple of them right over there on Atlantic Avenue, and you usually put down 10% of the bail amount, and that's money that even if the charges get dismissed, even if your loved one is acquitted, the family member who puts up that money never gets it back, which, you know, 10% of $10,000, that's $1,000 that a family member, a loved one is out, $1,000 that could be going to rent, food, any number of other basic, you know, costs of living. And so here's the thing, and I'm going to ask you all a question, is if you got arrested right now and bail was set at $10,000, how many of you could pay that full $10,000? Raise your hand. So maybe, yeah, you're an affluent
What do you all do for a living?
Exactly. So, okay, so maybe about a third of you. If bail was set at $10,000 and you only had to put up 10% of it with the court, how many of you could afford that, $1,000 right now? So many, many more of you, like maybe 75% of this room. So if bail was set at $10,000, but all you had to do was make a promise to the judge that I will come back to court on my next court date, and only if I don't, then I'll be on the hook for that full $10,000, how many of you could afford that? It's not a trick question. Every single one of you can afford that. And here's the thing is, under New York's current bail law, judges can actually set bail in all of those 3 forms. Right? They can set a 10% bail. It's called a partially secured bond, so you only put up 10% and you get that money back at the end of the case. They can even set essentially a bail where you don't pay anything up front. It's called an unsecured bond. And so we're running a program in the Bronx and Queens to actually do an assessment of a person's ability to afford bail, and then we're making a recommendation to judges to set a partially secured or an unsecured bail amount so that the fact of setting bail alone doesn't keep that person in jail simply because they're poor.
And is that something that you need to be a lawyer or a public defender to do? Can you, I mean, as a family member who's coming in, and Kalief, I'm sorry, Akeem, you might want to chime in on this. You know, what can everyone on that side of the table do to kind of influence the conversation on bail when they're in the courtroom?
Akeem, I'd love for you to jump in.
So actually, when you come from, well, in the case of other people who are obviously may not be in this room that can't afford a bail, the only thing that you can do is have your family members sit in there, or probably try and start a coalition where you're going to raise that those funds. But that doesn't come so often, and far and few in between. And so that conversation with the attorney or the public defender, or sometimes the 18B, is that only recourse that you can take. And at that's just a plea for that the next time when you go to court that can then be brought up to the judge. That doesn't mean that it's actually going to be taken into consideration. It's just a plea that you can make. So that's not actually very viable for those that are not in this room but come from the poorest congressional district in America, which is in the Bronx. And so those poor, and I doubt if the conversation or the question asked wasn't asked in the wrong way, but if you have rent to pay tomorrow or mortgage to pay tomorrow, then could you afford bail? And the answer is no. And so that's actually very viable for those that are not in this room but come from the poorest congressional district in America, which is in the Bronx. And so those poor, and I doubt if the conversation or the question asked wasn't asked in the wrong way, but if you have rent to pay tomorrow, to pay that $10,000 bail. Anybody? So what happens is there's life occurrences that happen. And if you could pay the bail, but you have to then choose between paying bail and rent or mortgage or car note or whatever of the many things that come up towards the end of the month or the year, then would you be able to pay that is the question, especially if you live in the poorest congressional district of America. And so that's the problem. Money should not be an issue, and that's what we're here to, I believe, talk about.
But as it remains, Albany is Albany, and the law is the law, and money is a big deal. It is this deciding factor for many people. And so, Dana, I want to come to you and ask, New York is unique in that we have an independent criminal justice agency that is now revising our bail formula, their bail assessment to try to have more influence over the judge's decision, and that's oftentimes in defendants' favor when they can say that, hey, this person has a family member who lives here and they work here and they're not going anywhere. Can you talk to us about what the city is aiming to do with that assessment and how that process is moving along?
Sure. So, and first of all, one of the things that I want to say is I actually really appreciate that we are starting this conversation about closing and unclosing Rikers with a conversation of what we need to do to make sure that we have as small a number of people in detention as possible, and really framing this as the closure of Rikers Island is really about the transformation of our criminal justice system and is a decarceration project, and I think it's important to center that as part of this, and so I appreciate the framing. I also, as I think others have already said, what we would like to see is comprehensive bail reform, and there's a number of other things that we would like to see and will fight for at the state level in terms of the types of legislative changes that are needed to make our justice system more fair. But that being said, within the current statutory framework, obviously the city needs to do everything that we possibly can to make sure that we are reducing the number of people who are going into a jail on a given day to as appropriately small a number as possible. And as you mentioned, we have right now the city's pretrial services agency interviews all individuals at arraignment to provide an assessment to the court of their return to court. This is a instrument that has been around since the 1960s, and we believe that it can be revised to be much more updated and also appropriate, and that once updated, we will see hundreds of fewer people in detention on a given day in New York City. So we are currently in the process of revising that assessment instrument. We have a research advisory council that the city has convened that has a number of different experts in the fields of risk assessment and criminal justice, but also who are looking at the issues of disparities, because I think that's one of the really legitimate concerns that people have about assessment instruments. Are they being used to mitigate disparities in the criminal justice system, or are they being used to exacerbate them? And so that expertise in terms of disparities in racial justice is something that we have brought into the Research Advisory Council. In terms of where this process is right now, is the people who are kind of working on this have been going borough to borough to engage with all of the actors in the criminal justice system who will have to have confidence in this tool. So public defenders, the district attorneys, the courts, to really ensure that we are best informed and can be most deliberative in its rollout. It's also something that we're working with. The city has put together 3 different working groups as part of the effort to close Rikers Island, a working group on reducing the jail population, a working group on culture change, and a working group on design. And all of those working groups have representatives of people from city agencies, but also nonprofits, DAs, public defenders, family members, formerly incarcerated individuals. And so this is one of the areas that the working group on reducing the jail population will also be looking at in the coming months. And so this is something that we'll be rolling out in the future, and we're happy to report back on, but that's kind of where the status is right now.
I think Kalief, Akeem wanted to say something on that.
Yes, and In keeping with that, and just your first statement of that we're finally happy that we're having these conversations, I think truth be told, maybe your population or certain populations weren't talking about this, but this was conversations that had been happening before the 70s, when our people were being incarcerated for crimes of drug nature that would usually get programmatic change or help when others were getting incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't something new that we are talking about now, and I think I'd be remiss to not speak up on that behalf, because these are conversations that we've been saying forever, that jails are not rehabilitative, or prison is not rehabilitative, and yet certain communities would get the programs that are rehabilitative or helpful towards rehabilitation, and certain communities wouldn't. So while we're talking about this today, let it be known, truth be told, that we've been talking about this forever.
I agree with that. And I should say, I agree with his point, absolutely.
And at the and toward it, later in the conversation, we'll talk about ways that people can take action and get more involved in the conversation and keep pulse of it, because it is ideal to have everyone who has a stake in the conversation having it, and not coming 20 or 30 years late to it. So that's something that we'll address later in the panel. And I think Professor Jacobson, you want to say something?
I just wanted to add another point to what Dana was saying. You know, one of the things that characterizes New York's system, we're a very unusual system in, well, a few ways, but one way is that 60% of everyone who comes through the system gets released on their own recognizance, right? So even before you get to bail and having a discussion about bail, we already release huge numbers of people on, who, as Insha said, come back, you know, more than 9 out of 10 times, right? Mm-hmm. So, and no other city approaches 60%. They can do 20, 30, 40. We're very unusual. And so one of the questions, you know, given what CJ, one of your questions about the CJA new risk instrument is, how high can that go? I mean, we're already sort of an outlier in the United States, but can that 60 go to 70? Can it go to 80? I mean, we don't know yet, but to the extent you can keep ramping up that number and having the success we've had with the first 60, right? You don't even get to issues of bail or bail reform, because there is no bail, right? People are just released and they come back on their own recognizance. So, you know, it is one of the reasons that, you know, our local incarceration rate is half the national average. If we actually could get the population down another 5,000, it would be a quarter. At that point, we'd have incarceration rates at a local level similar to sort of Scandinavian countries. So, I mean, it's the direction we're going in, but there is a huge opportunity to do more of what we already do, more than any other city in the United States.
I mean, to Michael's point, we do bail better than any other big city in America, but it's because America is singularly bad at incarceration, meaning we just do it so much more than is necessary for any logical purpose to actually take away somebody's liberty. And so we have a really, really long way to go, because even though we are releasing more people than we're setting bail on people, we know this in New York City, that still results in about 40,000 bails set each year annually. And what that also results in is people who just simply cannot make bail. The average misdemeanor bail that's set in New York City is $1,000. The average bail in a felony is $5,000, so that's less than that $10,000 sort of game that we just played. And yet almost 50% of New Yorkers who have bail set cannot make it and don't get out before the end of their case. So while we do bail well, better than other places, we still have a huge, huge crisis with how we do bail. There's no doubt about that.
I want to do one more question on bail before we move to what comes after Rikers. And so part of the reason that we are able to have this conversation is because Kalief Browder shared his story with us, and his family, his brother, has continued to kind of do the work to make changes to spare people others their experience. And we saw the governor last year propose criminal justice reforms that were not adopted by the legislature. and we're approaching, and Akeem, you were with the governor initially, and then when his re-election campaign rolled around, you were with Cynthia Nixon, his rival, pulling him to the left. But Cuomo was re-elected, and so as we approach this election, and the makeup of the Senate may or may not change, and we might have the same dynamic where we have Democrats passing reforms in the Assembly and then Republicans blocking them in the Senate. So I'm wondering from you, what can the governor do unilaterally if the dynamic stays the same? And if Democrats do win both chambers, is it a done deal, or is there still a fight there?
I think, let's just speak fact, Governor Cuomo has not been
Oh,
reelected.
sorry, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, primary.
He's just made primary, people. That does speak towards something,
I'm very
but
sorry.
Realistically, just to get back to it, you know, I actually was not with the governor. Physically, I would be there, right? Because I was invited to have weigh in on the conversation of what criminal justice reform looks like, because his staff does it differently than what the people want. That being said, in these conversations, we spoke of criminal justice reform as far as not just bail, but speedy trial and a real discovery for New York. And so those conversations were taken in, well, at least I want to hope taken into consideration by our governor. However, the proposal that came through from his office was nothing less than what anyone wanted. That's why his bill didn't get passed. And this is the governor. We did have the Genaris bill and the Walker bill that actually that did make it to the floor, which is a bill that's then picked up by the Senate, or by the Assembly and passed in an Assembly side, then gets passed, or looks to get passed on the Senate end. With these bills that were proposed, none of the criminal justice reforms that Governor Cuomo brought me up to Albany at the beginning of the year and at the State of State address, and announced to the public while addressing the work that I've been doing in criminal justice reform in my brother's name, that he would, and it wasn't just a theoretical statement, it was a promise with his words saying, I promise that I will get it done this year. Now, the governor has the ability to make something happen, like through executive order. When he didn't do that, and April 1st came, when his power to actually just put into the budget for this year the criminal justice reform that he promised, then I was terribly disheartened, because by acknowledging my brother finally after 3 years of waiting for New York to acknowledge what they did to my brother and people like my brother, when it didn't go through, although he made his promise that he would do it, I was very disheartened, very let down, and then I wanted to no longer rely on this form of government. I wanted to make sure a change came, whether that's through intimidation, by going with Cynthia Nixon, who presented a strong platform in which I felt I could believe in as a person that understood and sat down and took her time to listen to reform in the ways that we were talking about. I felt that was a better alternative. What we could do, look forward to, thank you. What we thought what I think I could look forward to in New York is another year of, coming next session, another year of lobbying or pushing as far as helping the governor understand that the people will not settle for less. And so that would look like another round of going up to your senators and your public elected officials to make sure they understand that this has to pass. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whatever field you're on, it does not matter. There are human lives that are behind these bars and do not need to end up like another Kalief for another 16-year-old to be alleged of anything that you're innocent until proven guilty for. And if the judge already allowed for bail, then that means the judge already determined your freedom is contingent on a certain amount. And that should be let go of, but the governor, and the Democrats in Albany, as well as the Republicans, need to get off their high horse and really just understand this is a human rights violation. And when humans are dying behind bars because of the culture of violence, or the culture of waiting and playing with the time clock of our criminal justice system, it has to change. It's just life that is behind these bars, not just a number, but they want to look at us as numbers.
Okay. So the next, thank you for that. And I'm sorry about re-electing the governor without the votes of the people. So I want to finally turn to the topic that brought everybody here, which is the borough-based jail plan, and this is the Commission's proposal to put to close Rikers, the penal colony style establishment, and replace that with 4 smaller jails in each borough except for Staten Island. And one of the unique things about this is that the Bronx will get a new jail, and the difference between where the jail in the Bronx is and where the jails in Brooklyn and Manhattan are is the Bronx jail is being cited in a poor and Black and Latino neighborhood. And these are the kinds of people who have already been harmed by these aggressive policing tactics, by mass incarceration, and here we have they're not very excited to have a jail coming down the street. So the first thing I want to talk about is the premise of this conversation, and a lot of conversation over the last year or so, ever since the mayor decided to come on board and embrace this plan to close Rikers Island in 10 years, is that it's a done deal. And that's not exactly the case, Dana, and I wanted to ask you, what does the city have to do to make sure that when Bill de Blasio leaves office, his successor can't just come and upend the work that's being done to move away from Rikers?
So I think it's a really good question. I think everyone asks that, like, what's the commitment? How do we make sure that the jails on Rikers Islands are closed at the end of all this, particularly with the timeline that goes past this administration? So, I think an important starting point is before the mayor's commitment to close the jails on Rikers Island, and just to acknowledge and center the fact that the mayor, my boss, and the city came into this because there was broad public support from the community and from the voices of people who have long been making the point that we need to do justice differently. And it is from the Littman Commission to the organizations that led the Close Rikers campaign to the 100 other organizations that signed onto it, to I think a lot of the media that began to look at what was happening in our justice system. It is that broad acknowledgement and moral call to action, I think, about what it would mean for the city of New York to close Rikers Island that kind of got us to this point to date. And we are at a moment in which, obviously, I'm proud that the mayor has made a commitment that this is the official policy of the city of New York, is that we are committed to closing the jails on Rikers Island, and that it is part of a broader effort to transform our justice system. And we at the mayor's office need to do everything possible that we can to move that forward. I can speak a little bit about what that would look like, but certainly in terms of what comes next, I believe that broad public support is also what we are going to need to bring this ultimately over the finish line, but also just to sustain just the focus on what is the why are we closing the jails on Rikers Island? That this is about dilapidated facilities and conditions that are completely inappropriate, but it's also about how do we bring down the number of people in jail? How do we change the culture of our city's jail systems? That again, this is a fundamental transformation process or project for the city's justice system. So, we have to stay focused on all of those things. Obviously, I think that there is the practical question of what comes next when we move from 9 jails on Rikers Island today and 3 borough facilities, none of which are facilities that we would point to when we say this is the solution, right? The barge is not the solution to closing Rikers Island. So it is about, how do we get off of the jails on Rikers Island, but it is also about, as we reduce the number of people who are in detention, how can we actually build a system that is much more humane? And so, as it relates to the proposed plan for the 4 new borough-based facilities, the timeline has been very, very aggressive because we do want to move this forward to make sure that this is something that is real, that we are on track. I think we've said that this is a long-term plan, but we need to advance it as much as possible. And I think that's where the commitment of the administration is in terms of kind of the process that we've been going through to date in terms of the environmental review on the proposed sites. We'll be going into a ULERT process in 2019. And our hope is that with the feedback that we've gotten and will continue to get from the neighborhoods and stakeholders as to how to make this the best plan possible, that it's something that we will be able to advance in this administration, so that this vision of what comes after Rikers across all levels is something that is real.
When do we get stakes in the ground? I think that's what people want to really know.
So assuming that we, begin the ULERT process in 2019, kind of the next steps in that is obviously it goes to the community boards, the borough presidents, the city planning commission, council vote at the, mid 2019. After that, we would do an RFP for design and construction of the new facilities. And our hope is that we would be, especially with design build, that I don't want to give an exact date for stakes in the ground because I think that that's something that the city is still figuring out what the timeline is, but that is something that we would see again those projects moving forward before the end of this administration.
Okay. And so talk about, I want to ask about the jail in the Bronx, and because it is particularly, there's a community there called Diego Beekman, and these are people who scrap together the funds to buy their buildings and to make a community with very little and make a safe community with very little. And so they're very concerned that when this jail comes to the Bronx, that it will either bring crime or it will bring gentrification, and either one of those is good for them, and they don't have the money to be crime fighters and to be and to fight off a Whole Foods. So I just want to ask the panelists, how can we make sure that these new jails don't become agents of harm especially in the Bronx?
I think the topic of discussion is no one in the Bronx actually, if you looked at the forums that's been going on in the Bronx, the community town halls that we've been holding, and the amount of elected officials who are not behind the governor's now proposal to shut down Rikers in his going into his second term, not in his first term, but in his second. But right now, what we could be thinking is, how do we divest the money that is already being invested in Rikers Island for jails that are not even being used? So what the governor and what the mayor could do right now, and you can tell your boss this, that there are 3 jails right now that are not in use but are being sustained financially, that we can actually use those funds and divest it into the community, bring programs and fund communities to have successful outcomes, instead of funding jails and hiring more COs, or even hiring more police to police the communities when we have enough of that. Right now, what we could be doing, instead of thinking about these massive jails that they want to build upward, well then, that's actually not beneficial to the thought of the mayor saying that we want to reduce crime. Reducing crime doesn't mean just building smaller jails. It means investing in the community. So let your boss know. The plan to shut down Rikers did not start with the conception, as she said. It came from the community having problems with the thought that our kids or our family or our loved ones are going into these facilities and not coming out either whole, sane, unharmed, or even alive. And so the thought did not start with the mayor. the thought did not start with the mayor. It started before the mayor even came into his first term, knowing that these were the issues. This should have been something he did or started doing, the planning at least, the first term, not the second term, knowing that he would not go into a long term with this.
So I think the point is really important, that it's also about the investment in communities and neighborhoods. And, I think it's important that we as the city not lose sight of, as we talk about the closure of Rikers and as we talk about, these new borough facilities that are part of the, plan to shrink the system and allow that, we also have to center what are the needs at the neighborhood and community level that are also being addressed and are frankly, part and parcel of a plan to, reduce the number of people in jail, because it is about investing in mental health supports and prevention. And I think, a longer conversation, I would, certainly be happy to talk about what some of the things are that the, mayor's office in the city is already, is doing in some of those areas. And I know my office has been very focused on supporting things like the cure violence programs and, neighborhood-based solutions to actually, support nonprofit organizations to do that type of work, because really that is how we build a different type of justice system. On the question of, the Bronx, and it is obviously a more, it's been a complicated situation in that in 3 of the boroughs, there are existing DOC facilities, and that is, where the kind of, and that are adjacent to the courthouses, and that there's been a focus on that, or, kind of in that exact neighborhood as the site for new facilities. In the Bronx, the facility that is currently there is the barge. That is a boat that is far from public transportation, that is, as I said earlier, not what we think should be part of the vision of a more just justice system and, what comes after Rikers Island. And so, as part of looking at how do we, where is there, a site that could house a new facility that, is city-owned, is near public transportation, has proximity to the courthouse, and, has the square footage. Those were the criteria that we went through and, heard from a number of different Bronx elected officials about other sites. So we, certainly looked at a lot of different locations before, moving ahead with what's currently the NYPD Toe Pound location. To the question of, the neighborhood concerns, I do think it's important, some of the, and I'm not saying that these are coming from Diego Beekman, but just neighborhood concerns that you hear about, well, what happens when, family members are coming here, or this is going to bring the criminal element. I mean, I think it's very important for all of us to, kind of understand and recognize that, the move towards borough-based facilities is because this is not, we're not saying that these are people that should be far, far away on an island and isolated, and that, there is not evidence that when there's been other, borough facilities that crime has gone up, and that, the ability to have closer visitation, more staff providers is something that is good for each borough, including the Bronx, and there's a lot of benefits to that. I think, though, the neighborhood concerns about those other issues around affordable housing and the need, about community centers and youth centers, there are a number of other concerns that we have to look at in conjunction and partnership with the neighborhood about what is, what would be best for Mott Haven, and that should also be incorporated into the plan. And we have been doing some.
Sorry, I said I want to cut you off, but it was a long answer.
Sorry. It was a lot to cover.
I want to ask. Michael wants to say something, and then I want to give the audience a chance, because we are unfortunately running out of time, and I know we can talk about these issues all day and night long, but unfortunately we didn't arrange this as a sleepover.
Yeah, I mean, I just quickly wanted to give the perspective from you mentioned the Lippman Commission, which was the commission that came out with a report that recommended this. I was on that commission. Insha also worked on that commission. So from the commission's point of view, And I want to, I think you gave the impression the commission recommended 4 facilities. The commission actually recommended 5, right? We felt strongly there should be 1 in every borough. The mayor, not Dana, the mayor made a political decision to take Staten Island off the table, and I think that's a real sort of political issue. It's an issue of equity, but sort of put that aside. So from the commission's point of view, we felt strongly in terms of siting, we didn't get into exactly where we would propose the jails being, but we felt strongly that the new facilities should be near or contiguous to the courts, right? Because these folks are pretrial detainees. The process of getting them from Rikers Island to the courts now is just a horrible, brutal, dehumanizing process. And to the extent that you're near, really adjacent to the courts, that's ideal. That's where these folks are going to go. Hopefully not a lot of them and not too much. So that was really important to us. And to Akeem's point about money, one of the things the commission did is we did realize this was going to cost a lot of money, right? Construction's expensive in New York, there's no question about it. But our analysis showed that after several years, this actually saves the city $500 million a year, right? And that for us was a pool you could use for all sorts of community reinvestment. And the reason it saves so much money, you're not doing this to save money, but the fact is, when you have a smaller, more efficient system, you need a fraction of the corrections staff that we have now, right? So we see the system going from 11,000 correction officers to 4,000 officers, very differently trained workforce. That throws off an incredible amount of money, right? So it certainly works at that level, and it does recognize, there should be all sorts of reinvestment in communities that need additional capacity, and this is one potential funding stream for that, because this whole process, even after you spend the money constructing new expensive facilities, will still save the city and taxpayers huge amounts of money.
Assuming the contractors don't drag this out.
Well,
I'm just
we
kidding.
did it, and we did assume that, right? We were very
did.
conservative in our estimates. So yeah, we did not want to be criticized for sort of underestimating what we understand are going to be huge construction costs.
Right. Well, obviously, there are lots of thoughts and even difference on, where the city should go in terms of direction on how it houses and treats people who are in its custody as a form of punishment. And so I hope that the audience, that you can see that even though you might have an opinion or an idea that's different from the person next to you, that there's room for you to create positive change in this area. So I'm going to turn to audience questions, my favorite part. There's a high school teacher in East New York who says, "Thank you all for being here and for the work that you do." Amen. The teacher says, "I'm a high school teacher in East New York, and unfortunately, a number of my students' families have interacted with the criminal justice system in some way. When I go back to school tomorrow, what can I tell them about what role they and other young people can play in reforming our current system?" And this is a great question because it's something that I wanted to ask our panelists anyway. I guess we'll start with Insha, since you're at the end of the, and just work back to me.
Sure. So there's lots of ways that everyday people can be involved with seeing our criminal justice system change. One way that I say to folks is, courtrooms are actually public spaces. Any one of us could go sit in them and we could watch. What are prosecutors doing? How much bail are they asking for? Why? What are judges doing? How much bail are they setting and why? What are the public defenders doing there? Are they representing people? Are they zealously advocating for their clients? And there's actually a program in New York City called Court Watch, and you can go to courtwatch.org, nyc.org, and sign up to become a volunteer, and you're actually adding to this database citywide, looking at what is happening in our courts and how is that impacting bail, how's that impacting who is going to jail, and it's something that anybody, whatever age you are, however much time you have, it's something you can volunteer to do. Also, there are community bail funds. Marcia mentioned the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund, and full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund, but you can volunteer with the bail funds. You can donate. $5 is $5 more towards somebody's freedom and their liberty. There are any number of ways you can give of your time as well as your resources to get involved and to really sort of hold our system accountable and make sure that it works for all New Yorkers.
So we talked a little bit about bail reform, but on a number of different justice-related issues. I think we will all be back in Albany in this upcoming session, and I think from my perspective, that is certainly a place in which us continuing to have a broad involvement and support for not just bail reform, although, obviously, first and foremost bail reform, but also speedy trial, discovery reform is really important. And also the issue of parole reform. So on any given day right now on Rikers Island, there are over 600 people who are in just on a technical parole violation. So that means they have not even committed a new crime. It is a violation of the term of parole, and that is absolutely something that we should see reform on. And so that's definitely something that I think as part of the legislative agenda moving forward will be a priority of the cities. But I hope others can get involved. For people who are interested in both learning about what the city's plan is on these new borough facilities, and we have a website that is out of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice that has updates both on this, but also on reducing the jail population and on culture change, and a newsletter that we send out with some regularity if people want to sign up. And also if people want us to come to them, or if there are school groups or community organizations that want to learn more about what we are planning and opportunities to get involved, we would absolutely, welcome going to those types of meetings or forums.
What about you?
Well, there's so many ways for, not just young people, but for people to sort of get involved in this issue. And, I wanted, Insha mentioned going to courtrooms. One of the things I tend to do with my students, at least who express an interest in this, is make them go to look at arraignments. And while on the one hand it sounds like a sort of mundane inside baseball in the bowels of government process, which at some level it is, it's a life-changing experience for a lot of these kids. Everything from what the place looks like, there are obvious questions about where are the white people, to how is bail set, why does it's a very jarring thing, and it is a good entry point just to, if you have an interest, to go. And if you're interested in advocacy, there's tons of, there's a whole coalition of groups in the Close Rikers movement that do great organizing and community stuff. If you want to do academic work and just study this, if you're interested in policy stuff, there's all sorts of opportunities to get involved. I think that, the more public discourse there is around this issue, the more transparency there is, the better. One of the reasons we on the commission wanted to close Rikers is because there is no transparency. It's out there. It's a penal colony in the middle of nowhere. You can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't understand it. And the more people that get involved, the more people who talk and advocate about this, just sort of regardless of what your initial interest or position is, the better. And that's generally true in the field of criminal justice, where criminal justice agencies in general are not particularly transparent. That's certainly true of jails and prosecutors and others. And so the more interest, the more young people and people in general that express an interest get access to these things and start working around them, the better.
Actually, there's those on top of those grassroots organizations throughout New York that actually does this work without equivocation. So we, as the Kalief Browder Foundation, we actually go into the courts in the Bronx, which is very neglected when it comes to their court and their antiquated system. We go into the courts and we do court advocacy and court watch. So a lot of people They have been volunteering and coming into our courts. We go into Queens, making it easier for other courts to get recognition as well, so that we can get families that don't understand the process going into court and advocating for them. We also work with the schools, and so we understand that when we say it's all about the youth, that we're not really involving the youth. So what we wanted to do is involve the youth in the conversation and the experience. So what we do is we actually go into the schools, we teach them their civic engagement opportunities and their rights, and then we also bring them in front of their elected official. And so if you have council members, which you do, you have council members, assembly members, senators, up the ladder. We make these appointments with the schools so that we can bring these, either the elected officials to the school or vice versa, so that they can get involved when they ask the right questions and understand that they have a part to play in this system as well. So it's not always on the government. We can actually invest in our communities and bring community policing to ourselves. We don't need the governor or the mayor to actually rule ourselves. We actually need them to oversee us. And that's where the system really should be. They are there to watch in the backgrounds and need help where needed. But we have to do the job on the ground for our kids, because they're our future. And if they're going to take care of us, they need the jobs as well. If they're going to take care of us when we get old, they need the experience and education and the tools to be successful in life. And that's where we are. The Kalief Browder Foundation wants to advocate for to end the school-to-prison pipeline, so that we can have a real future for us as well, not just one side.
So one of the questions is, you know, part of the design, the conception of the plan to close Rikers points to European models of prisons, and there's a very different history here in the U.S. that involves enslavement and Jim Crow and the institution of white supremacy. And so one of the questions is, how are European jails and prisons a helpful model for addressing incarceration in the U.S., given the specificity of U.S. history?
I mean, I think Insha alluded to, there's not a lot of best practice in the world around incarceration. Almost none of it is in the United States, and to the extent there is, it tends to be in the Scandinavian and some of the European countries, and it's obviously complicated. But the main differences are, after you get over there are differences in size and scope, and they're more sort of homogeneous than us, and they have a different history, all of which is true. I mean, we have a history of Jim Crow, right? Germany has a history of Nazism, and they designed their systems. I mean, Germany is one of the more progressive systems in the world, which may sound counterintuitive to folks, but they designed their system essentially as a reaction against Nazism, right? So you can see there's some potential analogy for the United States. But one of the reasons they're better, I mean, they tend to be way less used. Their rates of incarceration are far less than ours. They rely on prison far less than we do. And so they're smaller systems, they're better run, the facilities themselves are smaller, but that sort of central difference in some ways that you can sort of, even when you go into these systems, is that they're just run on the sort of principle of human dignity, and in their case, the European Convention of Human Rights, right? They're just a very different operating principle system. So it's a great model for us in some ways, despite the fact that people will say all the time, well, they're different, that, we're bigger and more diverse and we have more crime, all of which is sort of true to some extent. But they are the sort of North Star of how, if you're going to run these systems, that's how you want to run them.
Real quickly, actually, also, we have to realize that America is not that old of a country. And so comparatively, the experience that lies with Germany or in the European nations, America doesn't have that long history. And what we did have when we started this country was we were escaping that kind of paradox where we were escaping the British rule. And so we came over here and we actually then implemented, because we needed free labor. So America needed free labor to build their railroads. They needed free labor to build their schools, their buildings, their tobacco farms and cotton farms. So what they were very actually escaping, they then did to their slaves in America and their indentured servants. So what we don't have is a long history. We should, just like we do to our youth, look up to our elders so that we can learn and create or learn from their mistakes or even learn from their prospers, we need to do the same thing. When I ran for mayor last year, I looked at other nations like Denmark, who has done a better job at making things transparent information, whether it's healthcare, contracts made with their country, within the state, within the country, it's transparent. What we were hoping to do with my run for mayor is not actually just win, but to make sure our mayor understands, or whoever is going to take that position, to understand that we can do it better. Just look at other places. And here's the model. We were literally giving that model out there, exposed, so that anyone who was going to run can just take it, because we shouldn't be fighting each other for a position of public servantry. We should be actually learning from one another so that we don't have to fight each other and not do it what's best. And so looking at what other countries do, like Denmark or Germany, would have told us our big brother or our more experienced other countries have been doing it better than us. We should actually do the same thing and not wait 800 years later to then say, this is wrong, maybe we should change it.
Thank you. The next question it comes from is about post-release supervision. People can serve they serve flat bid sentences, and the city keeps them under monitoring after they have been released from prison and they're not offered from jail and they're not offered parole. And the questioner wants to know, why does this policy exist and what can we do to change it?
So if we're talking about post-release supervision, which is if you plead guilty to a felony and are taking what's called upstate prison time, so longer than 1 year, on what's called a flat bid or a determinate sentence, it's just a flat sentence, you might end up doing 3 + 5. And so what that means is you spend a little less than 3 years in prison, you serve 6/7 of your sentence, and then you have 5 years of post-release supervision. Functionally, it works exactly like parole. The local parole office is who actually supervises people on post-release supervision. It's not actually anything that the city is responsible for. Parole and parole supervision and post-release supervision is actually managed by the state. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I just wanted to explain what is post-release supervision in the prison context and how it works, and it's actually quite similar to parole.
The next question is about California and their recent bail reforms, if there are any lessons from New York there, and then from Michael and Dana, talking about the challenge of trying to move to assist off Rikers, but dealing with the resistance from groups like correction officers.
I'm happy to talk about the California bail bill. So Senate Bill 10 was just signed by the governor last month in California, and it does something that is actually pretty remarkable for America, which is California will be the first state to eliminate cash bail entirely. People think New Jersey did that when they started a new bail system in 2017, but what they actually did was basically make it really, really hard for judges to set cash bail, but they didn't flat out take on the bail bond industry and sort of say no money bail. California, in fact, did. That is a win in my view. What isn't a win, though, and what was part of SB 10 was the idea that we actually are going to expand the categories of people or the types of cases that might be eligible for what's called preventative detention, which means you go to jail, you're held in pretrial detention, and there's no opportunity for you to be released. And so what is actually quite worrisome about SB 10 is if you are on parole and a risk assessment instrument says that you are high risk based on who really knows what, because risk assessment tools are sometimes not very transparent and they are hard to challenge. But if you are in that category, there's a presumption that you will be detained, that you won't be released pre-trial. Given how many thousands and thousands of people are on, say, parole or probation, That's a huge concern in California, and it's a sort of a learning lesson for us here in New York as we're thinking about bail reform. What bail reform needs to do in order to be good, meaningful bail reform is certainly take money out of the equation, no doubt about that, but it needs to make sure there will actually be fewer, not as many, certainly not more, people in jail than before bail reform is passed.
So on the question of staff and kind of what does that look like beyond Rikers, I think it's important, to acknowledge that right now, the jail systems that we have do not serve well the people who are incarcerated and detained in them, and they also don't well serve people who work in the facilities. And so, when we talk about a more dignified environment and, and that being part of the future, I think we have to think about it as both, obviously how do we center the dignity of people who are in detention, but also how do we provide environments that are more safe and dignified and respectful for people who staff them. And, a lot of the things that are contemplated in terms of better programming space, more access to light, more access to outdoors, are things that are good for everyone. So we did a number of focus groups with a range of stakeholders. So focus groups with formerly incarcerated individuals and family members, but also focus groups with staff who currently work in the city's jails. And important to note, it's obviously the correctional staff, but there's also nonprofit and program provider staff, there's healthcare staff, there's educational staff. There's a lot of people, and the hope is that with borough-based facilities, there's going to be even more ability to have nonprofit providers and services in the facilities. That a lot of the feedback that we have heard is some of those principles that are part of the new plan. Again, programming space, sight lines, buildings that aren't falling apart, things that are easier to get to. Break rooms are, have a positive benefit for everyone. And so I think it's important just, again, that as we talk about what are the benefits of closing Rikers Island, that it is a benefit across the board.
Did you want to answer?
I'll just say in terms of the correction officers, on the one hand, obviously they're not huge supporters of this. On the other hand, because there's no way to sort of paint the fact that, at least again and the city hasn't come out with figures, at least from the commission's point of view, we're looking at a significantly smaller workforce, right? So from the union's point of view, they're going to lose power, they're going to lose membership, they're going to lose money. I mean, there's no way to sort of sugarcoat that. On the other hand, right, my argument is that their members will work in far more dignified places, right? There'll be places that are better places for everyone who's in them. There's no correctional officer now who wakes up and thinks, I can't wait to get to work early because I'm dying to get to AMKC just an hour ahead of my tour because it's so fabulous. I mean, no one likes being there, right? It's a miserable place. So I think there are benefits for correction officers, even though there'll be fewer of them. And, I will say one of their objections, and there's some legitimacy to this, is that one of their concerns is, Rikers is sort of miserable now, right? Their place is falling apart now. It's too violent now. Like, are you saying we have to wait 10 years or whatever the time frame is to do this? We need help now. And that's a fair point. I mean, the city is going to have to figure out a way to sort of do two big things at the same time, sort of this and address some of those issues, which are real issues on Rikers simultaneously.
One question that I really want to get to, we have time for maybe one or two more, is, this person has obviously been in New York a very long time, because they remember when New York City opened Rikers, they held it as a modern institution, the most modern institution of its kind. When they opened the Women's House of Detention, they said it was the facility provided decency, humanity, and cleanliness. Rosy language, and when they talked about opening Rosie's, they bragged about reentry and family integration and the questioner says, the litany goes on. I actually really like this question. The litany goes on, same language, light, air, modernity, dignity, reentry. Given the abysmal failures of jail reform in the past, what makes you think it will be successful now?
Great question.
Well, for me, I've been around a long time, probably not as long as the person who was here when Rikers.
It's like 150 years old.
And, I tend to be a fairly skeptical and cynical person in general. I'm actually pretty sanguine for a whole bunch of reasons that, this reform will happen. I think we're in a historical moment now where there's a fair amount of sort of consensus and, activity at both the community and government levels that something will happen. And we've gone through periods of reform and corrections, and it's hard to remember because a lot of people haven't been around that long. But up until the 60s, not in New York so much, but in the U.S. was considered sort of a model of a country that ran prison systems. We had very low incarceration rates. It was a system that was built on the notion of rehabilitation, not on punitiveness. And in the last 40 or 50 years, that's changed significantly, and in New York too. And part of the problem is those facilities which might have been at one time sort of shining examples of new jails are way past their useful life. They're horrible places now. That's true of the borough houses as well as the jails on Rikers. They're terribly designed. No one would ever design facilities like that now. And so they, even if they were, potential examples of, modern cutting-edge places at the time, they no longer are. And, one of the reasons the commission sort of came to the conclusion that you had to sort of close the place was we just didn't feel even with billions of dollars, you just couldn't make it better. You can make it a little better, but you could never get it from here to there. And so, just turning the place over, moving out, building places that are both smaller, more humane, that are run on principles of dignity. I think, the sort of politics are lined up in a variety of ways, even with sort of disagreements about strategy and what the end will look like. I do think some big reform will happen.
I think real quick, actually, if we're talking about successfulness when we're coming to the conclusion that this is, like, as I said, a human rights issue. But to make it more simplistic, if you want to understand the criminalization of poverty, race, and trauma has been infectively in our communities of poor, disenfranchised, and vulnerable people. So we've actually have history doing this same incarcerated term for over 100 years. So thinking of this being a new microcosm or experiment, because that's what it is, a new experiment, until you actually get the statistics or the analytics to prove that this is successful. In the meantime, there's human lives that's going to be lost or hurt or harmed or not rehabilitated. So I think we could do more as a people to understand that if we've been doing this for 100 years, there's the saying that one doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, it's the definition of insanity. So maybe we shouldn't be thinking of doing the same thing in a newer, nicer facility. The walls and floors did not kill Kalief Browder. The culture of violence killed Kalief Browder. The walls and floors did not abuse women that go into these facilities and take their children away. If they got pregnant, how do you get pregnant on Rikers? This did not happen because of the walls and floor and the niceties of these facilities. We have to start thinking of rehabilitative measures that will actually use and help people get to a better state of mind. That's more like in mental health facilities, not the old modern mental health, but what we know of social emotional learning as we are today. We are a progressive people, or we are a learned people. Let's use that learning in our qualitative research to actually put something forth that's helpful, not harmful to the people.
And I think to follow up on that point, in a lot of ways, right, there's two pieces to this reform. There's the sort of closing Rikers and new facilities that look very different than these facilities. And people will say, you know, completely correctly, well, if it's just that, right, why aren't you just going to have the same culture as you're saying in Rikers in these new places? And that's a fair point, which is the other huge challenge for the city, which I think is actually a more difficult challenge than actually building these places, which is going to be no small feat themselves, is that sort of completely changing the sort of viewpoint and operational culture of the folks that run these systems, right? That is something that is going to take a huge amount of effort. It will not happen overnight. There are sort of ways to do organizational change where you can get from here to here. But that has to happen, right? That has to be a huge part of this. And in some ways, although it gets a lot less sort of discussion than, you know, the buildings themselves and the money and the siding, that change, the change of the folks who run and work in these places and how they do their jobs, that is in some ways the central challenge. It is the most important challenge, and that has to start now, because you want, when you start to move into these facilities, you don't want to just move into better, nicer facilities. You want to move into a system that looks, acts, and thinks very differently in terms of framework, philosophy, than it does now. And that to me is the overwhelming challenge for the city.
Stephen's not here to drag me off the stage, so I want to squeeze in one question very quickly, because it's a huge population at Rikers, the mentally ill, and one of the question is, you know, when is the city going to provide mental health facilities that are capable of taking care of this vulnerable and neglected population? And is that part of the commission's thinking?
Well, the commission was, so on the one hand, and this is not just a New York City issue, this is a United States issue. So when you go back to looking at systems, whether they're in Scandinavian or Dutch or German, you know, a central part of their systems, you know, the reason they're always so amazed that we have so many folks with mental illness in our jails and prisons is, in those places, they have a completely separate system, right? They have a sort of forensic health system where once you're diagnosed with a serious mental illness, you are no longer in this system, you're in that system, right? We are just that is a piece that is just missing from, and again, this is not a New York issue, it's a US issue, both in the 3,000 jails that we have. No, I get it. And so, you know, on the one hand, it was sort of an overwhelming challenge for the commission to think both about closing Rikers, building new facilities, and building also, envisioning a separate forensic mental health system. But part of what our charge was in the design of these places to essentially have to deliver forensic mental health services in these, they have to be in the buildings, but they're sort of separate and apart from the sort of regular security. So you could imagine, you know, people could advocate for, well, in fact, you need a separate system. You should be building 5 other buildings that are. No, I understand, and that's a fair point, but it's a piece of the system that's missing. It's a huge issue. The Los Angeles jail is the biggest mental health facility in the United States, and so the commissioner was very sort of attuned to that. We couldn't quite get to the point where we could take on building another system entirely, but that is ideally, that's what you would want.
I don't think that's ideally. I think that's repugnant to think that a Department of Corrections can't even manage OCFS. Their children who has, or OCFS, Office of Children Family Services, deals with children for the history of their work. Department of Corrections doesn't. So by putting Department of Corrections in the hands, or our kids in the hands of Department of Corrections who doesn't have a history of dealing or properly dealing with our youth is repugnant to even think that they can have even a hand in our mental health and hygiene. There should be a different entity, or else all we're doing is investing New Yorkers' money into a correction system to help build their experience or their lived experience, which We already have facilities that do that. Leave it to them, invest in those so that we can actually build. But what we're doing is investing in the Department of Corrections. They have no history. They have definitely they're tone deaf to the people of New York who says we don't want you to have this kind of control. But yet they still force their way into Horizons so that they can be the ones ruling over our kids. And now that's why we have this big problem in Horizons where the officers don't want to actually go through the training that's necessary. We can't rely on a system that doesn't have the experience, the knowledge, the education, or even the reasoning to do any of this. So I don't think it's hopeful. We can't hope that our people don't get harmed or our kids don't be abused or sexually abused. We have to do what's best for them, and that doesn't mean hope. That means experience, education, knowledge.
All right, Marcia has stood up with the microphone and she's making her way. So this is obviously a very important issue, and we're glad that you came. There are many questions that still remain, but I got a feeling we'll be having this conversation again over the next however many years.
And I can promise that we will have more of these conversations here at the Brooklyn Historical Society, starting with the unanswered questions tonight. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everybody, for being here.